All right, welcome into the Bobby Carpenter Show featuring my man Josh Perry again this week. And we've been rolling along here, getting a lot of stuff going. Post Super Bowl edition of the show. So thank you for tuning in. A lot of big news. Ohio State, they get a coordinator, they lose a coordinator, they get a new coordinator. Is it a better situation for the school? There's some other stuff popping off in the Big Ten. Michigan losing coaches left and right. Obviously, we had the Super Bowl as the Chiefs take down the 49ers, I believe, what was it, 25-22, and another overtime thriller. The NFL is getting exactly what they want with all of that. CJ Stroud getting it done, getting Rookie of the Year honors. We're going to have our tailgate talk. Starting out the gates, Josh, I mean, your just kind of initial thoughts on the Super Bowl, some of the things that you saw and kind of what you absorbed from, last week.
Yeah, I mean, first off, phenomenal game, as you said, right? Like the NFL certainly would want a game that came down to the wire, and if they can get extra football out of it, it makes a lot of sense there. I know a lot of people were like, man, it was a little bit of a slow burn in the beginning before you really started to see some action. I appreciate both styles of football. I appreciate when the defenses come to play and the offenses look a little bit hampered, but when you wanted big plays and big moments, certainly they existed there. Feels like this was a tough one for the narrative on Kyle Shanahan. Coming in, everybody talked about how he had blown leads in the past in Super Bowls and that he was going to have to be on his A game. I thought he went away from the run game a little bit there in the second half of the game, particularly in the third quarter. That doesn't help things. We've got the overtime fiasco. And I think the biggest travesty there is not necessarily that they took the ball first. It was that the players had no idea really what the strategy was, because you could talk me into a legitimate rationalization, a legitimate explanation for taking the ball, for kicking the ball. Like, I think if you have a thought out plan, whatever, you can defend that. But what you can't defend is guys who are like, well, I didn't even know there was a different rule in the postseason for overtime. That's bad ball. But on the positive side, Andy Reid, phenomenal coach. We knew that. I think that he's a guy who knows how to galvanize a team. And I look at the moment he had with Travis Kelce, where he didn't get too hot. And of course, you don't want your star tight end doing that, but he knows how to manage those personalities. Travis Kelce came alive in the second half. And then Patrick Mahomes, I think it's premature for some people, but for me, appropriate, start having that conversation about could he be the best of all time? Because from what we're seeing right now, that man is different. So I thoroughly enjoyed it, and ultimately a great NFL season.
It was pretty tremendous. We'll put a pin in that Travis Kelce talk because I think that there's a lot there that you can get into and begin to extrapolate into sports at large. And everybody has takes on kind of where it is and how it impacts, the NFL game, the college game. Should people do that? How it ultimately looks. So there's a lot there. Obviously, it feels like, are you of the belief of this narrative, Joshua, that the NFL produces a scripted product? I know that, we ultimately got a great game. And you're a little bit younger than me, about a decade younger. So through the 90s, the Super Bowls were not good. But since I felt like we've had that Rams Titans Super Bowl, they've all been pretty captivating. And they come down, people are saying it's scripted, this and that. I mean, there may have been some holding calls that could have been called more on Kansas City, and we'll kind of get into that with the impact of the Niners D line, especially with Nick and Chase and how they played. But this scripted narrative, turning it into like WWE, Raw, like it seems far fetched to me when people start talking about it. Because I think football is it's the ultimate game when it comes down to decisions and strategy, because
Right.
it's not a continuous flow game. There's 11 players on each side of the ball. There's a ton of strategy that goes involved into it. And I mean, Kyle Shanahan, he's had double-digit leads as a coach and now one as a coordinator, lost all three games. I believe that he's a really good football coach. I think he
Yep.
ultimately will get over the hump. Not all that different than Andy Reid, but sometimes like the world moves against you in ways, and momentum's a very curious thing to get your hands around.
Yeah, the momentum thing I think is huge, right? And I look at the beginning of that second half. Patrick Mahomes throws an awful interception. It's like, all right, well, the
Mhm.
Niners are getting ready to put their foot on the Chiefs' neck, and all of a sudden they like go backwards on that drive. They don't do anything with it, and it's like, the elite coaches are able to grab onto that momentum and they pull the rope as hard as they can. It feels like Shanahan has been a guy who's let go of the rope with his team, so he's got to figure that out. But I'm with you. all the people on social media that are calling him a bum, I don't think bums get to go to 2 Super Bowls as a head coach, right? Like, I just don't think that happens. So he is a good coach. Now, to get to the scripted part, did they let the guys play? Yes. And I know people like to say that the Chiefs get favorable calls, but I'm looking at the game and I feel like there were a couple spots that might have been questionable. There were some holds certainly that the Niners had that they let go. Quite frankly, in that overtime period, the Chiefs had a huge penalty go against them where they'd be able to get off of the field on a 3rd down early in the overtime. And it's probably game over, and it makes it a little bit more interesting. Now, I'll ask you this question because you played in the league. I played in the league. I never received a script. I don't know if you had one sitting in your locker, but I personally never received a script. So I can tell you firsthand, from my experience, not scripted.
Yeah, the script situation, obviously, for players, they look at that and obviously laugh. You're playing as hard as you can to try to get it done. Maybe you make a play, maybe you don't. But I think you don't want to see a Super Bowl with a lot of penalties. And so they didn't
Right.
call a ton. I thought they called some impactful ones that were clear and obvious. I don't necessarily have a problem, and this was the deal. I thought they held Nick Nick Bosa a lot, man. You watch him coming off the edge, and there's a couple where it's not like inside you're pulling. He's getting like the over the top, like shoulder, like he's trying to turn the corner. And I mean, you played with his brother Joey, and know
Yeah.
those guys how they can bend and how athletic they are. And to see him do that, and then like all of a sudden just get yanked down. Some similar stuff was happening with Chase Young. I think it was a really good showing for the Buckeyes, though, as far as what their defensive ends were able to do. Both of those
Yeah.
guys I thought played very well. But it just seems like they kept the flags in the pockets. And are you a favorite, like a fan? Would you rather see more penalties called? Because I feel like we called a lot all season long. And then you kind of get to the Super Bowl, and it's like we're going to keep those things tucked away.
After the first quarter, and if you're an official, you set the tone based off of what you've called and what you haven't called through that first quarter. Just call it the same for the other 3, and I'm
Yeah.
good to go. And as somebody who views the sport, somebody who played the sport, I'm fine with the way that they called it, because at least on defense, I know, okay, well, they're gonna call if it's like a blatant holding, but I mean, I saw some hook and swats that they probably should have called that they
Yeah.
let go on both sides. You get a little tug on the jersey, they let that go. And I feel like that's how most people try to play the game anyway. You want to, get a little advantage if you can. And so for the officials, to your point, in the biggest game, you don't want to insert yourself too much, because I know that's been a criticism of NFL officials throughout the season. It goes back to Kansas City when they were playing against the Bills, and they were like Kadarius Toney lined up offsides all game long, and they want to call it on the biggest play of that game. And so for that sake, hands off, let it go.
Yeah. And I agree with you. Like they held a standard and kept it pretty consistent throughout. And I think for any sport, at any level, that's really all you can ask. Because every coach will tell you. I know, you and I both played for Coach Fickle, and like, I'm getting held. He goes, I didn't see a flag. Like that was his famous thing. So if they're not calling it, it's not holding. And usually, and I know as much as we bemoan in the script and everything else, most officials are calling it pretty even. Now, if
Right.
you have a better D line or this or that, or secondary, maybe it comes into play a little more. But it felt like it was fairly even. But watching early in that game, man, I felt like Nick Bosa had a chance to, if the Niners wanted to potentially be MVP with how he was attacking that game and the
Yep.
chaos he was ultimately causing. So we'll get into that. We've got some more Buckeye news here. Holy smokes. This offseason, Joshua, for Ryan Day, like, you talk about work during the year. It feels like he's had to do more work this offseason than even during the year. So we'll break down some of the moves that are happening. One OC in, one OC out, bring another guy in. What's the relationship? How's this going to work? We'll tackle that next here on the Bobby Carpenter Show. Welcome back into the Bobby Carpenter Show. And hey, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you like, subscribe, leave comments. If you're watching on Bally's, thank you. Anywhere on social media, make sure that you're interacting with us as much as you can. We love to get your interactions. We got Tailgate Talk coming up here in a couple of segments where we answer all of your questions about everything that's going on in the world of Ohio State, world of sports, everything we'll answer for you. Some big news for Ohio State. I love the Bill O'Brien hire. It seemed like a home run. Then all of a sudden, Jeff Hafley says, you know what? I'm done coaching in college football. I'll take a pay cut. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to the Green Bay Packers. With that, the BC job opens up. Bill O'Brien, Joshua, Boston, Northeast, New England native. He's got a son with special needs. That's their doctor is up there. Like a lot of things make sense. It felt like the world was moving against Ryan Day with this because he had a guy who was a coordinator, was an NFL coach, was a former head coach, checked all three big boxes we were looking for. He ultimately gets the BC job. And then you're wondering, well, what's Ryan going to do? Now, I had heard rumblings before they were looking at Chip Kelly, but Chip Kelly had a buyout at UCLA. It didn't seem like that marriage, was going to be long for it anyway. And lo and behold, Bill O'Brien leaves. Can you blame him after leaving only a month?
No. I always felt like this was going to be a short-term situation, maybe a one and done. And you mentioned all of the reasons for him to want to go to BC. He's from the area. He's got a special interest that would want to put him back in the area. And ultimately, I felt like this was a guy who wanted to run his own organization once again. He had done it very well in college. He had done it very well in the NFL. And I think he's one of those personalities that, you know, you can get along with for a little while, but ultimately he's got that I want to be the boss mentality. And so he's taking that back to BC. I think this was something that Ryan Day could have forecasted a year out, right? Like I think he hired Bill O'Brien with the idea of okay, who's my short list for next year? The issue was the short list for next year had to become the list for this year. So certainly something strange to see, but again, all the movement that's going on right now, like nothing's out of the question in this day and age of football coaching cycles.
Yeah, it spins quick. And so we all get it, why he left, you understand it. And we thought 2 years probably max, maybe only a season. But with that, then Chip Kelly enters the picture, enters the fray. And it was rumored he was in the contentions before. He talks about Candle potentially at Toledo. Another guy who checks some of that head coach OC box. But Chip Kelly, coached Ryan Day in college. Like they got the coaching relationship. He's been an NFL head coach. And regardless of what people might think how he did and how it kind of ended, like he did some revolutionary things and they had some good teams and had some success. He has had success at the college level. He's an offensive coordinator. Like he checks all of those boxes. Do you feel the same way about the Chip Kelly hiring as you did about the Bill O'Brien hiring? Maybe better, potentially worse.
Not quite. I think I feel better in some ways, maybe a little bit worse in other ways. When I look at Chip Kelly, the biggest question that I'm going to ask is about the personality. Because the thing that I loved about Bill O'Brien is I knew he was going to be a no nonsense guy, could come in there, play the bad cop role for Ryan Day, just kind of like, I don't know any of these guys, and I'm going to just come in and I'm going to be a disruptor in certain ways. And I told the story about how he's on the sideline there with Tom Brady, and Tom's trying to get on one of the guys after he threw an interception, and Bill comes up to him. He's like, "No, that's on you." And using foul language when he does it. Like that's what you want to see, talking to the GOAT when you're the OC there. And so he could bring a little bit of that flavor to Ohio State. But the question with him was scheme continuity. How much was it going to be of his playbook and how much of it was going to be what Ryan Day had already installed and what he wanted to do? And where would that line be and what would that mesh look like? So then I look at Chip Kelly and it's like, okay, this is a guy who obviously was disenchanted with what was going on at UCLA. Rumors are that he had lost a little bit of favor with some of the boosters, the athletic department. There was some tension there. People in the program said, it was a bad marriage. He was sniffing around at basically any job that was open because he wanted to be out of that situation. Guy who's not known to be somebody who loves and embraces recruiting, but with
Sniffing
all the
more than Bobby
recruiters,
Brown, man. He was looking
don't do
thirsty.
that. Don't do that.
Okay.
No,
Right.
no, that's from you, not me. They talk about the recruiting prowess with him, and certainly with Ohio State, there are plenty of recruiters on that staff, so not as big of a question. But is he going to be that same type of disruptor? Would be the only thing I ask. I look at the flip side. You want to talk about scheme continuity? There's going to be a lot of it because these two guys have worked together for so long. Professionally, the player-coach relationship, I love that aspect of it. And I also look at the additions that Ohio State made this offseason. You have Travion Henderson coming back. That's like an addition because he could have been gone. And then you have Quinshawn Judkins that you got out of the transfer portal. That is a true addition. And one of the things that Chip Kelly has done, as well as anybody, is the run game schemes. This dude, when he was at Oregon, it was top 10 in yards per game rushing and yards per rush. Every single year he was there just about. UCLA, he even did a great job of creating that run game. And I'm like, the one thing that I always felt about Ryan Day was a little bit more pass first. Now you get that run emphasis in there. I was watching some tape. I saw a counter where they pulled the guard, they pulled a tight end, they pulled a damn wide receiver in there, and he was throwing his face into a block. I'm like, I love this kind of stuff. And so from that standpoint, I'm extremely satisfied because I think they have the weapons and now they can truly mesh the scheme in there.
It kind of feels like as much people get lament that Ryan's more of a pass guy, and a lot of quarterbacks kind of lean into that pass mantra because that's what they know, the pass game. But I mean, and I think we'll get into this next segment, but what's interesting about Chip is you mentioned that UCLA. I mean, he had DTR. I mean, they were a run first offense and like a lot of unique and creative runs. And so I
Yep.
think that he's a guy that, similar to Bill O'Brien, but like different as far as how they do it. But I think that there's going to be some new elements where you look at the continuity. Him and Ryan Day obviously speak the same language. They understand the
Yep.
same process. He taught Ryan Day. They've coached together. But if you look at like UCLA's offense and what they did, obviously far different than what Ohio
Sure.
State's doing and how they're going about it. And him with, Trey and Quinshon Judkins and what they're ultimately going to be able to do. It seems like this could be a pretty good marriage with how much he likes to run the ball. And then you kind of layer in, Hartline and Day and their ability to
Yep.
pass it.
I love it. I love it. And I think that's what makes the most sense there is I think that you have a good balance. And let's not forget Justin Fry, who has also worked with Chip Kelly in the past. And so, they're going to be able to speak the same language and communicate what the expectation is for the offensive line to make this thing work. I mean, I look at a guy like Zach Charbonnet, who transfers from
Yeah.
Michigan over to UCLA. He's one of the best running backs in the country statistically. And that wasn't on accident. It's because of what they wanted to do from a philosophical standpoint. And the running backs that Ohio State has right now are way better than he is. And that's not a knock on him because I thought he was a phenomenal player. That's a compliment to the guys on Ohio State's roster. So I'm curious to see, once again, what the balance looks like run pass. But the one thing I do know is if you're somebody who's into creative offensive design and into scheme, this is going to be a lot of fun to watch.
So we're going to get even more into that because there were some moves that had to happen to get this to happen, to get Chip Kelly here to Ohio State because it wasn't going to be easy. I think that may be why they leaned on Bill O'Brien at first. And then there's also some big news. Team up north, Michigan making some news. What's Luke Fickell doing at Wisconsin? Maybe teaming up with one of his old teammates, a guy who Joshua knows very well. So we'll see kind of where all that goes. We're going to break that down here next on the Bobby Carpenter Show. Welcome back into the program. Talking a little bit of Chip Kelly, the addition of him as the offensive coordinator to the Ohio State coaching staff. Former college coach Ryan Day, they coached together Philly and San Francisco as well. Now taking the place of the departed and short-lived stay of Bill O'Brien, who was a nice personality change up, as Joshua had alluded to. But I think there will be some positives with Chip Kelly here that maybe Bill O'Brien couldn't bring, and maybe some negatives as far as fully outside original thought, but you look at what he did at UCLA, as we mentioned, far different than what he was doing at Ohio State. But Joshua, you work with NBC, you were at Big Ten Network for a long time. You're on Bally's, you follow this as much as anyone. There was a buyout that had to be had to get Chip Kelly here. And usually you don't have buyouts to take head coaches to an assistant level. And from my understanding of this, I mean, this was alignment through the athletic department. I mean, you have the new AD, Ross Bjork, coming in. You've got President Carter, who you saw him in Nebraska, like his alignment with sports. It feels like this was a move with the administration that if you're a pro sports and pro football guy, you should feel pretty good about.
Yeah, I'm there with you. And Ross Bjork, I think, was a big signal to how aggressive the athletic department wanted to get in the university in general when it comes to the sports programs. And he even mentioned that he wanted to flex his muscles there. And you mentioned President Carter, and I'm 100% there with you. He even goes on record as saying he's a football guy. And so you do have a level of alignment that exists that I think we were all kind of looking for Ohio State. Now, this is a crazy situation, right? Like, I don't think that every hire you want to make, you want to be buying somebody's contract out. It doesn't feel like something necessarily that makes a ton of sense. But I think we are in a scenario right now, and I've talked about this before on many platforms, where the university, the athletic department is giving Ryan Day zero excuses for this upcoming season. I think everybody understands what's coming together from a personnel standpoint. I think people also understand how good of a coach Ryan Day really is. And you look at the win-loss record, I know people point to the big games. You can say whatever you want, But now it's like, okay, he's going to be able to show up for these big games because we've given him every single resource from a coaching staff and hiring perspective, from an NIL perspective, and I'm totally here for it.
Yeah, I mean, usually don't see a buyout. I think it was $1.5 million. And it seemed like Chip in UCLA was like a game of chicken. He was looking at any job that would come open in the NFL. The rumor was you just you get sick of coaching in a place, Joshua, that like claims they want to win, but they're not
Mm-hmm.
devoting the resources to it. And that makes your job really hard. So it felt like, hey, I can get to the NFL, or heck, I don't want to deal with all the stuff of being a head guy. Ryan Day's making more phone calls about non-football related issues than I think any coach in the history, not think, minus the think, any coach in the history of Ohio State football. And that's something that's kind of congruent around the college football landscape. So obviously there's a lot going on there, but they get in alignment, they buy him out, they bring him in. And so that's going to be big. You actually play, I mean, you were on that team, the championship team, right after the year that Chip Kelly left.
Mm-hmm.
When you see that, so obviously he had his fingerprints all over that. I mean, what does a Chip Kelly coached football team bring to the table?
Yeah, well, first off, I know they were Pac-12, and people look at the Pac-12 and they're like, oh, they're not as tough. They're not as tough. Those guys wanted to
Soft
come
with
out.
two F's, I think is what
Right.
you were
That's
saying.
what they like to say. Those guys wanted to come out and hit somebody. Like, let's be perfectly clear. Now, the body type that they had out there, I think that was the biggest difference. When we lined up in the semifinal game against Alabama, I looked across at the other sideline and I'm like, these dudes look like us. And that was really the first time I had an opportunity to say that all season long. And then when we played Oregon, I said, these dudes really don't look like us. And that gave us confidence. So now you put the mentality that they already had with the body types that exist in the Big Ten. It feels like a good marriage. The other thing that we had to deal with on defense, a ton of eye candy. And I mentioned the big counter that I saw on tape. Those are the types of things that really mess with linebackers, because on the counter, you're thinking, okay, or you get power, you got one puller, I got to get over one gap. You got counter, two pullers, I got to be over two gaps. Well, the third puller's coming. You're like, well, hell, coach, where am I supposed to be at? Like, I don't even know where my gap is anymore. And so they can window dress it, but you can also be physical at the point of attack, and that's a pretty good plan to me.
Um, Other news, Sharon Moore's lost a lot up at Michigan. It seemed like it was going to be Jim Harbaugh, maybe Jesse Mintor, handful of other guys. Now it's looking like a mass exodus. They kind of tie the tourniquet off, stop the bleeding. They bring in Wink Martindale. I believe he was with the Dolphins last year, correct? DC,
I think he was in New
New
York with
York.
the Giants. Yep.
That's right, with the Giants. He had the falling out. That's right,
Yes.
with Brian Dayball. And so he ends up leaving. You like the move of bringing the NFL coordinator into college?
The only reason I like it is because it's a similar defensive scheme to what Michigan was already running, right? And so I think you have continuity. Like, he can walk into that meeting room and immediately speak the same language that they knew. Very unfamiliar, I think, for the players. I think he's going to have to adjust the way that he attacks this. There's always going to be the recruiting question for guys that come from the NFL. And then ultimately, how good of a teacher are you when it comes to college players who are starting from a knowledge base that is much smaller than guys when they enter the league? But they got a big name. They got to do with a ton of experience and somebody who's familiar with the defense that, quite frankly, I haven't seen a defense as good as what Michigan had this past year in a long time. Like, all those things are very important to them.
So, former coach at Ohio State when you were there, defensive line coach, Mike Vrabel, alumni, goes to Houston, obviously makes his way around Tennessee for 6 years, very successful by NFL standards. Surprising that he also got fired. There's an anonymous report that, he might be too big of a personality for some NFL owners. But is he too big of a personality for his former college roommate and our former linebacker in DC, Luke Fickle?
Absolutely not. Those guys like to get down, and I'm excited to see if those two guys can work together in some capacity. When I say get down, I mean literally on the floor grappling with one another as grown men. Like, they
Kind of like a
haven't changed.
roadhouse type deal.
Yeah, a little bit like that. Now here's the interesting thing, and I want people to kind of read the tea leaves here, and I have no inside information. I'm just out here spitballing. Michigan has targeted Wisconsin's defensive line coach to become their new defensive line coach. That's what the Twitter streets were telling me today. And so Luke Fickle already had this idea before any of this was in motion, that he wanted Mike Vrabel to spend time around the program. Mike Vrabel, obviously unemployed, great in terms of working with defensive linemen. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think it would be interesting with somebody who was already engaged in conversations about being around. If that role does open up, I think Luke Fickle is going to have to ask him the question of, would you take this job and how can we get this done?
The question I think that'll be the one that Luke asks him. The question for Mike is like, do you want to take a year off? I mean, you've been running at full speed. You got done playing. You went to Ohio State to help your guy Luke out. You stayed on with Urban, and then you went into your NFL career. You've been running on a treadmill. Like, do you want to pump the brakes and go around and visit guys who you know in the league to maybe pick their brain and see what else is out there? That'll be the interesting piece. But the allure of friendship, I mean, that's a big deal. And coaching with guys that you like and guys that you respect is something never to be underestimated. All right, we're gonna put a little pin in that. We're going to come back because Joshua brought up some Travis Kelce getting after Andy Reid. We got Taylor Swift chugging beers. I mean, there's all kinds of news from the Super Bowl that we'll get into. Maybe even Joshua's favorite commercial as well on the halftime show. All that coming up here next on the Bobby Carpenter Show. Welcome back into the Bobby Carpenter Show. Chiefs down the Niners for their third Super Bowl, back-to-back Super Bowls as well for them, 25-22 in overtime. We talked a little bit in the opening segment, Joshua, about the game. 49ers taking the ball first in overtime. Were you surprised, though, even outside of that, just at the amount of turnovers? And we had Pat Mahomes throwing an interception to come out of the gate, a couple fumbles early on in the game after teams running. Then you have the special teams, I don't know if you call it a muff punt, the muff that
Yeah.
kicks off the defender's leg, the blocker's leg. I mean, uncharacteristically sloppy, I think, for what usually Super Bowls are fairly crisp, at least on one side.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Patrick Mahomes this year look a little bit looser with the football. He was trying to force some throws. I think that was certainly what happened there. That's not a shock. Some of the fumbles on the Kansas City side, like dudes are punching at the ball extremely well, and I think that's just a well-coached defense. I would say the same thing about when McCaffrey got stripped, and the one on special teams I think was just like a fluke play. Certainly, you would like to have a little bit more awareness when you're getting the Peter call out there, but things like that happen from time to time. So yeah, it didn't, like, thinking about it, didn't feel as sloppy as it actually was because I felt like there was so much tension in that game anyway. But certainly those teams, like you feel like, Super Bowl time comes around, you don't get to have, 5 turnovers in a game. That's bad ball.
No. Yeah. So you mentioned the turnovers. And I believe the yelling, as we talked about Travis Kelce, and there's the pictures circulating everywhere, the internet, social media, sports radio, sports TV, everything. Travis Kelce, like chest into Andy Reid's shoulder, like in his ear, screaming. And I believe that was after the Pacheco fumble in the red
It
zone, if I'm
was.
not mistaken.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of segue to that. Your thoughts on Travis Kelce? Because there's been a lot of people that have come down like, hey, that's wildly inappropriate. That's over the line. You can't do that. He's a leader, this and that. And I want to hear your take on this situation. You played in college, you played in the NFL. Kind of, it's the Super Bowl for heaven's sake. What are your thoughts?
It is inappropriate, but also, like, guys are wound up. You got one game to become a champ, right? And for Travis Kelce, he's a guy who's also getting a little bit long in the tooth. I'm not exactly sure he sees a ton of other opportunities to go out there and win championships. And so when he feels like he can be a guy that impacts the game, makes a contribution positively for his team, he's going to be fired up. And again, chesting up your coach, dude who's a little bit of an older dude, is not the way to always do it. But I'm not going to police the emotion of one of my best players. And I think that's the biggest credit I give to Andy Reid in that situation. Cool as a cucumber, didn't say get on the bench, didn't say I'm not going to put you back in the game, probably didn't address it at halftime, and they're not going to talk about it until this offseason. And I think that's the right approach because he understood the intent of what was going on there. And the actions are not to be supported, no doubt, but the intent was for a good thing, and ultimately they won the game. And it's because they have leaders like that in the locker room who pound the table for when they want to make plays. And again, I said it, second half, Travis Kelce goes out there, we have like 98 yards. Like,
Yeah.
he knew that he could be an impact on that game, and that's why he was so fired up.
And so here's the thing, like people talk about this, like as you go through stages of sports, people are like, yeah, I've never seen any of that. Well, most people don't get to play professional sports because then it's grown men coaching grown men. This isn't high school or little league or heck, even college. Because someone goes, you would never have done that. I go, I remember vividly in a game that I may have gave Tress an earful on the accepting of a penalty on defense that I thought we should have declined, making it 4th and 8 as opposed to 3rd and 18. They end up converting it, and I'm like over there screaming at him afterwards, and he kept it very calm. But you have guys, and how many times this, Josh? Have you seen people on the sideline where things are said where dudes get way out of pocket, and like there's arguments that are very, very passionate and emotional, and so much of it is like everybody's heavily invested into this. You spend not only a lot of time, but your emotional energy, like your physical, your psychological energy, going through injuries, rehabbing, and all this, and like you're on the precipice of being enshrined in one of the great achievements in sport history. And I can understand the passion because I guarantee you've seen it on the sidelines yourself.
Man, I mean, last time I was on here, I told the story about how me and Luke Fickle had a little bit of a disagreement on the
Yeah,
practice field, took my helmet off and
practice.
gave myself a little timeout because and I'm not that type of guy, but sometimes it gets to that point where it's like, no, I'm convicted in the way that I feel. And I'm not going to take anything else. There's no other answer but my answer. And then as grown adults, at some point you come together, you have a conversation and you hash it out. And when you're a good player that's in good standing, I think you get some leeway
Yeah.
to be able to express yourself as well.
Well, that's what's interesting. When people know you're heavily committed and you're not someone just ranting over there like a
Yeah.
lunatic, like you have a backing, you're going to get, like you said, a little bit of grace. And I've always told
Kadarius
people this.
Toney couldn't have done that.
Yes, people that have built up a long resume of success and investment, like you're given grace. And part of it is I tell people what is said on the sideline, dude. Guys get to the locker room, you shake it out, you get a hug, like, hey, we're good. My
Yeah.
bad down there. And it's all fine because you can't be judged by the in the crucible of that moment.
Right.
One other thing, I don't know if you saw it. Did you see Taylor Swift chugging beers?
I
I mean,
did.
I mean, I don't think she was overexposed in that game. I thought it was okay. I mean,
I agree.
they, I don't know what people want, but like if I'm going to watch someone who's worth $1 billion, self-made, under 40 years old, and I see there and watch them like pound a cup down and then hammer it down and they catch it on national TV, especially as a woman, like, dude, I'm gonna tip my cap. She earned a little bit more of my respect right there.
Brother, I've been saying this all year long, and I'm here for this love story. I believe it's real now. I didn't before, but there is also not a way to get the type of marketing that she has gotten all year long
Yeah.
for free. She has free exposure that's probably worth billions at this point, right? And like that, what you just said, she felt like a normal young lady in that moment, and I loved it.
It was pretty tremendous. And I thought it was awesome. And listen, the NFL, they said that was the first time there was like hair care, some beauty products. You know that the partners are loving it because you're bringing in a whole nother advertising demo that was not there before. And I'm curious to see the final numbers this week as they're released. But I
Yeah.
guarantee you, with the quality of game, the gravity of the moment, the stars, the teams, this has to be the highest rated Super Bowl that we've probably ever seen. So, coming back, we're going to get to our favorite part. It's Tailgate Talk, where we answer your questions about the things you want to know. And there might even be a Super Bowl question in there for Joshua and I. We'll get that coming up next here on the Bobby Carpenter Show. Welcome back into the Bobby Carpenter Show as we kind of wrap up the Super Bowl, the hiring of Chip Kelly, the leaving of Bill O'Brien, an offensive coordinator. A lot of news, but now we're getting to Tailgate Talk. It is our favorite segment. We answer your questions. One of the first questions we had fired away, Joshua. Thoughts on the halftime show of the Super Bowl and where you thought it kind of went?
I loved it for the most part. I thought the ending fell a little bit flat, but I was willing to excuse that because I was into a lot of it. I wanted to see Usher dance. We got that. I wanted to see him on the skates. We got that. I wanted to see what friends he would bring out. I loved some of the appearances that were made there. He even did a medley of some of the older stuff that maybe wasn't like, super popular music, a little bit more of the R&B, but for the people who are real Usher fans, you felt that. The biggest criticism I have is one
Oh,
Alicia Keys, and big fan of her. Alicia Keys, great catalog, great performer, looking right. She can't sing anymore, and we've known for years that she can't sing.
why is
And the
that? What
first
happened? Like,
Well,
why is that?
I don't know. I've got some conspiracy theories I'm not willing to share on this program. But the first note that was uttered out of her mouth was garbage. And it didn't get much better after that. Now, I know this isn't her fault, but the NFL went ahead and they posted her portion of the halftime show on YouTube, and they pitch corrected her performance for YouTube. And that bothered me. It really bothered me. So that was my only criticism of the whole thing.
I mean, can you roller skate like Usher?
I cannot. I wish I could, honestly, because it just looks like so much fun.
I mean, I was impressed because people are like, oh, he's a good skater. I go, listen, man, if you stumble dancing, you recover. You fall on roller skates, bro, you're
You're
going
done.
down. Like you are cooked. Like this isn't kind of like a little stumble at all.
So the other part that I don't think people give enough credit for is he's like a true performer with all the dancing. You mentioned the skating.
Yeah.
And like I can't jog on the treadmill and talk at the same time,
Oh
let alone
yeah.
do all that dancing and try to sing. Like it's amazing.
The guys that do that and they don't lip sync any of it. I mean, you could hear him like audibly trying to get air at different points. The shape you have to be in to do like a hard 5 minute cardio with 3 wardrobe changes and
Yep.
dancing around. Like I give Usher at 45 years old, like this dude
Yeah.
isn't 25. He's starting to get up there. So the last 2 years, if you're someone that's my age, like you've got the early to mid 90s kind of crowd. And then I felt like you just picked up me in high school and you had all my high school, college, like early NFL. So I've
Yep.
enjoyed the last two. They've been very good. And thought a lot of them. First, next question here coming as well. What's your opinion on who fills Joshua the 10th assistant coach's position? You like defense, the special teams? You think there's anybody in mind? Currently, James Laurinaitis is the GA linebackers coach, but he's been out on the road recruiting because they haven't had that spot filled.
Yeah, man, I go back and forth on the special teams coach versus a full-time position coach. I know some schools dedicate a full-time special team spot, and I understand the importance of that. We had a dedicated full-time special team spot, and it hasn't necessarily been great. So I'm kind of on the you know divvy up the responsibilities between a few staffers, and James Laurinaitis, it seems like might be a good candidate there. Get you a full-time linebacker coach, so Jim Knowles can really be a roaming coordinator, a guy who has cachet on the recruiting trail. The biggest question is, how great of a coach is he? Because he's a guy who's super green, but it's James Laurinaitis, smart guy, a connector. I'm sure he's a really good teacher. Like I would feel confident in him filling that last spot there.
I know this. He was coaching with Marcus Freeman and Luke Fickle won it. There's a number of guys who I
There were
value
plenty
their
of
opinion.
programs that
Yes,
wanted him. It wasn't just Luke and it wasn't just Marcus. Like he had other programs that were going after him.
absolutely. And there's still opportunities, I think, for him even in the NFL. So um, a lot of different options for James. I agree with you there. I think he would be the natural fit. I could see them maybe going with an assistant D line coach, maybe to segue Larry out and transition him and make him maybe the special teams coordinator, assistant D line coach. That was Fickle's first title when he got there.
Right.
And then maybe you elevate James if Larry moves on at the end of the year. I could see that potentially happening as well. Um, Another question here, Joshua, final one. Which players will make the biggest jump this year for the Buckeyes? And then maybe a little bit tongue in cheek. What was your favorite memory of the Bill O'Brien era?
Oh man, I'll start with the Bill O'Brien question first. Is I know some of my former teammates made a trip down to the Woody so they could meet the new OC and be ingratiated and whatnot. And I think they're gonna have to make a second trip here. So best of luck to them. I think as a unit, the offensive line has to take a big leap. I think that's pretty obvious there. I would say that's the one unit that I'm probably not super confident in at this point as a whole. And so I'm looking forward to what that progression looks like. Outside of that, quarterback is a question, but you like the mix of players that are in contention there. Wide receiver should be good. Can a guy like Carnell Tate take a big leap? How about Brandon Ennis, who we heard a lot about? Is he a guy who can really take that next step there? Love the running back room, go through basically everywhere on defense. I feel pretty confident. So it'd be the offensive line and then some of those talented wide receivers for those guys to follow the legacy of the players that came before them.
Yeah, I think that'll be it. I mean, who's going to be the guy that emerges? Obviously, Emeka Ibuka is back, but outside of that, who will be the other two or three guys that'll really emerge? does Jeremiah Smith make that jump as a freshman? Is it Carnell Tate? Is it Ennis? Like there's a lot of different options potentially there. Offensive line, I wholly agree with. Defensive wise, I think on the defensive line, we saw a nice sample size. Jack Sawyer started being more productive as the season went
Yes,
on. Him and JT both, I think, have been very solid, but maybe not that impact player. So those guys, and then in concert with maybe Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson,
sure.
like those four guys rolling through. Maybe they try to blend them to get all on the field. Larry Johnson,
Yeah.
famous for the Rushman. How does that ultimately look?
I like Kenyatta a lot.
He's dude, Kenyatta watching him run, move,
Yep.
rush the passer. He reminds me a lot of a guy who I played with in DeMarcus Ware, who he's a gold jacket dude. I'm not trying to
Pretty
say that
good.
we're getting to that level, but he shares some physical attributes and traits.
Yeah.
Can he get to that level of play? Well, we'll see if he ultimately gets there. All right, that's it for tailgate talk. Coming up, we're gonna wrap up the show. Joshua's got a little some streaming opportunities here for you to watch as we're going into the doldrums of football season before we get into spring ball coming up here next on the Bobby Carpenter Show. Welcome back into the final segment of the Bobby Carpenter Show. Thank you for listening and watching, however you're doing it, whether it's on Valleys, whether it's on social media somewhere, whether it's on YouTube. Like, subscribe, leave comments. We appreciate all of it. We're going to have a huge show next week. We'll get Schlegs back on. We're going to have some talk a little bit about the Buckeyes' prowess in the Rookie of the Year honors and how that's going. But first, we're kind of entering the football doldrums here. Joshua, we're gonna have the combine coming up. We'll have spring ball here in a little bit, but there is some dead periods on the weekends. So you're gonna have to find some other things maybe for your viewing pleasure outside of just college hoops, NBA, maybe some hockey. I was suggesting maybe Jack Reacher to you on Amazon Prime. You brought something else on another streaming network though.
Yeah, on Peacock, they've got this wonderful show that you can check out. It's called From Couple to Thruple. And the whole goal of the show is to bring on couples who are looking to add a third to their relationship. And they bring in some singles and they have the opportunity. Yes, they have the opportunity to pick out who their partner is going to be. They put
Ooh,
them through challenges. They want to test the strength of the relationship, what the boundaries are, and ultimately the connection between all of these people. It's not censored, so there are some things that you may hear and see that should not be viewed by people under a certain age. But if you're an adult who enjoys some trash, maybe risque television, this is a program that you should enjoy.
that sounds pretty tremendous there, Joshua. Do you watch this with the wife? Is this like a couples thing, or is this just a guilty pleasure for you?
We watched it. It was myself, my wife, my father-in-law, and his fiance.
Oh no,
So we
that's
had the whole family watching this, and there was a scene where a young lady was getting ready for one of the throuple dates, and she needed to do some maintenance, and she needed her husband to help her maintain some certain areas she could not reach with the razor on her own. Uncensored, very interesting.
that definitely sounds fairly interesting, Joshua. I mean, we're talking about couples shaving here for a throuple date. I mean, I've things I didn't even know existed. I mean, you're opening and expanding my mind to some new realms
I
of
didn't know they existed before I watched Bobby.
well, I mean, we'll have to dive on into that. I'm usually for the good, wholesome family viewing. I mean, we're watching Chicago Med and different things like that at the
Sure.
house, but obviously there's a lot of other stuff out there. And we're gonna have to dive on in because right now the NFL is over. We've got the draft coming up. There'll be some Buckeyes in there, probably a light draft for the Buckeyes. We'll break that all down and combine everything else and spring ball coming up. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of the Bobby Carpenter Show.